Welcome to Laurier's Teaching Excellence Conversation Series. I'm Deborah Van Eyneton, Academic Director of Teaching Excellence and Innovation at Wilfrid Laurier University. Today I'm with Anne-Marie Joy Henry, Laurier International's Global Engagement Coordinator, who received the 2023 Staff Award for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. Anne-Marie approaches intercultural learning as a bridge that connects diversity to inclusion. In the various programs that she designs and delivers, such as the Intercultural Certificate and pre-departure sessions for Laurier students going abroad, Anne-Marie shows the courage and skill to acknowledge, explore, and unpack challenging concepts and discussions relating to culture. She nurtures an environment of trust and respect in which participants can grow their skills and connections, and I'm so excited to talk to her today about her work. It's so great to be with you here today, Anne-Marie, and I'm hoping that we can actually start by talking about what have been extensive travel experiences, right? And interacting with youth and communities in other countries in really concrete ways. So I'm hoping that we can sort of start there and reflect a bit on what that taught you.
Thanks so much, Deborah. I think before I came to Laurier, I spent more than 14 years working with a number of organizations, but primarily one was a youth volunteer sending organization. And we worked in a bilateral way. So I was working with groups of Canadian youth and youth from a partner organization, and I had a counterpart. So that first laid a foundation for reciprocity in the work that we were doing. We would spend 3 or 4 months in a Canadian host community and then 3 or 4 months overseas. And I think the broadest learning that I had was that for the Canadian youth, when they went abroad, they had an expectation of difference. And so adaptation was super easy for them because they had this mindset that I'm going to see new things and I'll try new things. But those same Canadians living in a host community in Canada that was not their own community faced so many barriers in navigating difference.
Really?
And for me, that was where my approach to intercultural learning expanded because I started to see that, in a diverse country like Canada, but also in just within one cultural context, there's so much heterogeneity, and we're seeing that difference, and it's harder to identify the difference when you have the assumption of similarity.
Right.
And so I saw my
Right.
role as I continued year by year to be going abroad to help those young people, whether they were from Canada or whether they were from our partner organization, to stop that judgment and choose curiosity. And as a facilitator working in partnership with my counterpart, I also wanted to build my own curiosity and recognize those places where we could find learning from each other and model that for the youth who were also working in partnership because each of them had a counterpart with whom they lived in the Canadian context and then while they were abroad.
So give
So,
us a sense of some of the countries that you
oh
were,
my gosh, so over 14
getting these
years,
youth
I
together in.
sure I had the opportunity to live all across Canada as well. So
That's really neat.
I did a program in British Columbia and then in Hungary. I did two other programs in British Columbia. One, I went to Kenya. I went back to Kenya a number of times. I did a program in Winnipeg and Ottawa that also went to Kenya. I did a program here near to um, not that far from here in Hanover area. Hanover. We went to Thailand, so it was a farming community. I did a program in Costa Rica, a program in Peru, a program in South Africa, a program in Ukraine. I'm sure I'm missing things, but India, I also did a program in India.
Oh,
So I had a
wonderful.
lot of
Okay.
different cultural realities to explore, and I worked with youth from those countries and then diverse Canadian youth from across the country. And in the last 2 or 3 years that I was working with this organization, they shifted their funding, so they were mostly including Northern and Indigenous Canadian youth. And so the young people that I was spending time with were teaching me a lot because that was really new for me. And also, I think the other thing that was really magical about that was their experiences, if they were coming from the north, living in other Canadian contexts, were quite unique for them as well. And
So was
so,
that tough? Because when you think about what are the toughest lessons that then prepared you
yeah,
to prepare Laurier students to go out into the
yeah.
world and, you know,
I think the toughest part were my own biases, for sure. And also just being able to recognize that I was not always the best person to make a decision in a new cultural context. So I really had to call on my counterparts. And anytime that we had a team that was mainly youth from the North or Indigenous youth, we were working with interns who came from similar backgrounds. So there's a kind of humility when you maybe don't recognize at first that a challenge might be coming from some kind of value difference or um, a practice or protocol that's unfamiliar. And you have to step to that other person and say, all right, I don't know exactly what's going on here. How are you perceiving this situation? And you really have to listen and be curious. And then that gives you more of a capacity to be a good support for those young people who are experiencing the world different than you might experience it.
mhm,
And I'd say the number one challenge of travel and working interculturally is wherever you go, you're there. So you take everything with you, your whole life experience, your identity,
your biases.
and your biases. Yeah. And so
Yeah.
you end up having to kind of battle against yourself sometimes to really, you have that familiar feeling of judgment, and then you have to think, okay, I need to set this aside. What else could be happening? And that's going to be more useful in supporting other people's inclusion in the spaces that you're creating and in the communities that you're working. So,
So you've got all of this, thinking and reflecting from your experiences in different countries, different communities, people from the north, right? And then you come to Laurier. And so you're working at Laurier International, helping prepare our students, as I said, to go out into the world, right? Can you talk a little bit about the
sure.
programming that you do here for
Yeah.
us?
So there's sort of two halves to what the work that I do. So I work with Laureate students who are about to travel. So maybe they're going on an exchange. So that would be an entire term or even a full year where they're going to go to one of our partner institutions.
Do you know
And
offhand how many partner institutions do we
yeah,
have?
it fluctuates, but it's more than 60 right
Oh,
now
wow.
and more than 20 countries.
I
And
was just wondering about that the other day.
yeah, and I think what's really exciting is that, when young people are heading abroad, they might have traveled like as a tourist, but there's something really amazing about landing somewhere and integrating in a community for
Yeah.
3, 4 months at a time, kind of digging deep where they land. And those opportunities for learning are really there. So part of my role is preparing students to go on exchange or other Laurier sanctioned international travel. So maybe they would do a field course with a professor where
Yep.
during reading week or during the summer, it's very condensed, 2 or 3 weeks in a different country. The professor is with them. So we would do pre-departure for that and reentry. And yeah, so any Laurier sanctioned travel, we work with the students. We also have like an online pre-departure that students can do for like shorter opportunities, like if they're doing like a case competition or yeah, traveling for a conference, those kinds of things. So we support them. And then we do what we call international at home programming. So that's like the intercultural certificate program.
Right.
And we do that in partnership with Human Rights Office and CSETI, like the Center for Student Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And so we have a number of facilitators on that team, and I do the administrative side of that, but I also facilitate in the classroom. And that's really a lot of fun because many faculty have partnered with us to bring modules that we do in co-curricular learning into the classroom. So one example of that would be over the last four fall semesters, I've worked with Professor Jacqueline and also the community service learning for the students in human rights multiculturalism class to invite international students into the classroom as volunteers to discuss the topics that they're learning about. So it started during the pandemic. We did it all via Zoom, and we invited international students to come into little like Zoom breakout rooms to discuss the themes that we were learning. And
So
now,
you'd have these modules, the students be working through things,
yep.
but then working alongside with them would be international students to make it real.
Yeah, so they would just come in. So, for
Great.
example, this year, how we did it is that we would go in and deliver the workshop for the intercultural certificate. So maybe it would be like Ben Yang, who's the director. He would
Yeah.
come in, he'd introduce the concept of culture. So that would be with the students who were taking the class. And in the same week, on the Thursday, like that happened on a Tuesday, on the Thursday, there'd be 1 hour where the international students would arrive. And now the students would share their learning of what they had got from that workshop and then have a like guided discussion about a same topic. And so the international students were there to kind of add that lived experience to what they had just learned. And so the themes of those conversations would be directly connected to the themes that they were practicing in the workshop. So it gave them a chance to sort of take it that one step further. And that, I mean, the outcomes are fabulous. There's a spotlight on our webpage, and you can read their personal reflections. And I found that, like, what's super exciting for me is when students at the end say, like, why don't all Laurier students have to take this class? Like, that's one of what the students said to us. Or, this is the first
That's a real measure of
like
success. Yeah.
this is the first time that I felt like I got to bring my whole self into the
Gosh,
conversation.
I thought that was great.
and
Yeah.
and I feel like those kinds of outcomes for me are that makes it feel really exciting to do the work that we do.
Well, it's really transformative, right? Because you're changing their worldview,
Mm.
which is really,
Or
really important.
maybe not changing their worldview, but helping them have the vocabulary to identify and describe their worldview. Because
Yeah.
I don't think that, a 3 month class, in 13 weeks, that they're necessarily shifting. But I do think it's something that it allows them to be curious about their own culture and to even identify the aspects of their life that belong in that cultural bucket. I think a lot of times people don't recognize that what they do is different than what other folks do. They just assume that because they're doing it, it's a cultural norm. And so once they have that opportunity to really be surrounded by people with a lot of different worldviews and to really articulate them to each other, that gives them the space to really know themselves in a different
Can
way.
we dig into that a little bit? Because in your dossier, you talk about how you use the intercultural praxis
Mhm.
model that was created by Dr. Catherine Sorrells in your approach to intercultural training, and it's probably embedded in the certificate. And this model kind of moves the learner from inquiry and framing through multiple stages, then to action. But it really strikes me that the start for that though is that spark of curiosity. You have to
Mhm.
ignite that. How do you do that, right?
Yeah.
So the theoretical model for me is really based on the ability of the facilitator, of you, to be able to get people interested in others, right?
Yeah,
That are different from them.
I think we're all inclined to be interested. And so I don't feel like it takes a lot of, I don't have to light a fire necessarily. I think I just have to make space for, like, for example, for those guided conversations to happen. I love that tool because the praxis isn't a cycle that has to start with inquiry. All of the portals that are there, so inquiry, framing, positioning, discussion, all of those can happen as the first part.
Yeah.
And students can really choose which is most helpful to them in navigating that situation. I like to ask students to think of a time where something didn't work the way that they wanted. So, when there
Right.
was something that happened that was unexpected or something made them feel uncomfortable and they're just unsure. Now, look at those options in the praxis. What could be helpful in knowing it? Do they need to think about that situation by reframing? Is there something that they need to
Different
shift?
lenses. Yep.
Maybe they're looking at it at a very micro level and looking meso or macro would be more helpful. Do they have to think about positioning, like who was at the table of that discussion, who wasn't in the room? um, Inquiry, like what kind of respectful ways can they ask questions? Because maybe the interaction is between themselves and a cashier at a store. They don't have a lot of time to invest with that individual person, but is there resources that they can find so that the next interaction that they have is improved and
Yeah.
they've broadened
Yeah.
their experience? And how can they triage or triangulate a lot of different perspectives so that they're not just asking for one, stereotype or one generalized approach, but they're seeding their learning with many different resources. And so that really connects for me in seeing every student as capable, every student as a wealth of knowledge of their own life and having many experiences, and then just making space for them to connect the dots between each other. And so that, like, when I walk into the room, I don't see myself as a teacher, I see myself more as a facilitator,
Yeah.
where I'm bringing together resources, bringing together the experiences, and bringing together the people who are already in the space, and also asking people to inquire about who isn't in the space, right? And what does that look like for them? So students are keen to do that. Like that's you and typically when we're doing international at home programming, students are signing up themselves. So they make that choice to join and they have already that spark of curiosity, right?
That's
So
wonderful. Yeah. Can I want to push back a little bit in terms of um, the model that Sorrells is kind of,
mhm,
laying out for use. What happens in a context where most people don't speak your language? So you're going into a situation, and I'm
mhm,
drawing on my own experience actually here.
mhm,
What happens when you're going into a context where you know the some of the misunderstandings can be because of language,
yeah,
right? How do you navigate that? And I'm sure that you've navigated that a million times in your travels, right?
yeah.
And how do you convey that to students?
I think there's so many ways that we can misunderstand one another. And what happens for most of us, I would say, well, I'll speak for myself. When a misunderstanding happens, I probably start by that first level. Like the first feeling I have is like, oh, this person is doing something problematic, or this person is being a jerk, or this person isn't considering me. Like it's very easy in that moment to kind of get defensive
Yeah.
or to feel left out when you don't understand, or to think that the reason that the unexpected behavior happened or the unexpected word was used is like a fault or a personality flaw. And so I think if you can just again move yourself back to that curiosity mindset so that when you feel that very familiar feeling of something,
Hey, why is
like
this happening?
is
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
start by saying like, oh, could this possibly be a misunderstanding of culture? And that's when you can start kind of peeling back the layers. So I think it's that. And I think what Dr. Sorrells does really well is recognizes that all of us have that capacity for curiosity. And if we're thinking in kind of more of a social justice mindset, then we need to be the agents of creating a just and a harmonious and a sustainable
Yeah.
community. And so if that is one of our core values, then that's going to change the behavior we have. So if I'm in a space where I don't understand the language, but I'm with somebody who can help me out, so somebody who can maybe do elbow translation side by side with me, and
Yeah.
I'm still not understanding something, I have to like ask myself like what's my motivation in that space? So do I need to be understood? Do I need to have a play by play of everything that's happening? Or do I need to be present and
Mhm.
engaged in a respectful way? That can look a lot of different ways. And sometimes that might mean that I don't understand everything. If I know that the outcome is for me to be present and engaged, then that's different than the outcome of for me to drive the
Right.
conversation,
Yes.
right?
Right.
Mhm.
Yes. A
Mhm.
little bit of positionality there too.
Mhm.
Um, one of the things that really comes through in your nomination package, and it's really lovely, is how, students, faculty members, other staff really comment on the fact how you create learning environments where students can really connect with the material, but they really connect with one another. And one of the quotes from the dossier that really strikes me is there's one of your students that says, I learned a lot about myself, but I also realized uh, that I could connect with my fellow classmates much more deeply, right? And I'm paraphrasing here, but
Mm.
because of the kinds of things that you're doing with them. What are the strategies you're using in the classroom to get them to do that? It's not just about, the praxis, intercultural
Yeah.
praxis model. It's not just conceptual, you need to engage with each other.
I think as educators, sometimes we need to get out of our own way. And I think a lot of it comes down to trust. So I do think that when we give a guided discussion question, for example, I don't need to be the one who is there and present to hear everything that's happening in that small group discussion. I can trust that they're able to show up in that space and
Bring their whole
bring their whole
selves.
self.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah.
don't need to be monitoring as much or um because I don't want it to be a situation where they're looking to me for a right answer. I want them to look to each other to share. When I was working with Professor Jacqueline, I remember at the very beginning when we were putting together the discussion groups, and she said to me, "Well, how are we going to divide the students up?" And I said, "Well, like we know that we just want to have two two students who are from the class and two international students." And she said, "Yeah, but how do we pair them?" And I said, "Well, random is going to work just fine." And she said, "Well, how are we going to know that they're going to be able to work well together?" And my question for her was,
This sounds
how
exactly like what I would be
how would we have
asking.
any
Yeah.
idea of who wouldn't work well
Yeah.
together? We don't know them. We don't know, even if we knew them for a year, we still wouldn't know.
So your assumption is that of course they can work together.
Of course they can work together, and
Oh, that's
and
great.
when they can't, we'll
Mhm.
be there to offer tools to assist. So we still have to be present. We still have to see if silence is happening, that's when I might intervene.
Right,
And then,
right.
but I'm not going to walk in and say, "Why are you being silent?" I'm just going to come and say, "Oh, what have we been discussing?" And let them, you know, I'm going to be
Yeah.
curious in those moments as well. And I think sometimes when we get out of our own way, that's when some of the most rich learning can happen. And if we don't see ourselves as the only one who's guiding or creating the vessel for the learning to happen, then I think a lot more can happen. I have a really good friend who once told me this analogy about craft dinner. So this is the analogy. If I come to you and I say, "Okay, here's a box of craft dinner. This is what's in it. There's some cheese, there's cheese mix, there's pasta. You just need to add water, you just need to add heat, and then we'll eat," right? We're only ever going to eat craft dinner, right? Which isn't that exceptional. But if instead I say to a group of people, like, "What do you have to bring to this meal? And what can we prepare together, and what do you normally use when you're preparing this meal?" And we each all share the ingredients that we have, and we each all
It's going to be a
share,
heck of a lot better than craft dinner.
we're going to feast, right? And so
Right, right.
it's really that mindset. I think that if we just walk in with craft dinner, we're only ever going to eat that really
Oh, I love that.
neon orange pasta that probably isn't culturally specific to anyone.
So I'm just going to follow up on there because this is related. So then how do you create inclusive classrooms that kind of bring in diverse learners? Because you must have students coming
Yeah.
from different places, right, into an intercultural space.
Mhm. One of the things that um, maybe doesn't feel so obvious to the students themselves in the beginning is if they look around and they don't see themselves represented, or they feel like if they would acknowledge it as not being a very diverse space. And then we did have some times where maybe the international student volunteers didn't show up because they had midterms, and so there was fewer students
Right,
there for those
right.
conversations. And then so we'd have a group where they'd say, like, "Well, we're all Canadians, so how can we answer these questions?" And I'd say, "Well, why don't you try it and see what happens when you each have that conversation without
Mhm.
that international participant. And they would recognize that even amongst themselves, that diversity exists. If they look at their own family values, if they're looking at their own life experiences, the diversity is there. And so it's just hard sometimes for students to name it. So we're giving them opportunities to increase their vocabulary as we're exploring, some of the different concepts that we're exploring. And so I think that that's important. I think at the same time, um, you can kind of go too far where you sort of think like, well, every space is a diverse space, so there's nothing that I need to do. I don't, and at that, and I think that's important to just be really attuned to the folks who are there. And when you're hearing or seeing things that have the possibility of excluding or creating a barrier, just name them as they happen. Not in a way that's like chastising someone, but just in a curious way again. So if I hear somebody who's sharing a story about, how their family does something, but they're making a generalization that that's normal or that's the way it is, then I might say, oh, so where did you learn that, or where did that come from? And then I might ask, does anybody do that differently? And then we're going to hear a lot of different perspectives, so that instead of saying like, hey, wait a minute, don't make a generalization, which can be very confronting to someone, if you can give them samples or examples of what might be, other realities or other narratives, then the possibilities will exist in the room. It's impossible to have 20 people together and not to have 20 stories. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And when you think about our colleagues at Laurier, right, in
Mm,
encountering a lot of diversity in their classrooms. My graduate public policy course, for example, this term, for the first time in a decade, I had five international students in the class. And so suddenly, and I didn't expect it, and so then I had to rethink assumptions I was making about background knowledge, about the kinds of things that students might be interested in for policy case studies,
mm.
all kinds of things that I hadn't kind of thought about before. But it also helped me re-examine what I was doing in the course.
They say that about accessibility too, right? Like when you talk about things
Yeah,
like curb cuts at the sidewalk, and people who say, right, as soon as they lowered the curb for folks with mobility challenges, it meant that, moms with a baby carriage still have more accessibility, right? And I think if you're thinking about internationalizing your curriculum, like when you look into the room and you said, okay, I could identify that there's 5 international or 6 international students, probably many of the what we would consider domestic students also could have international leaning
absolutely.
worldviews, right?
Yep, yep.
Especially if they're the first in their family who
Experiences.
are experiencing, university, or, it's impossible to know when we look at a room who's present. And so we should just assume that diversity, and we will find that richness there. It will be there. And
So that's a good kind of tip for colleagues at Laurier, right?
mhm.
Assume diversity,
And I
plan for
think
it.
the other thing too is, even if like group work or group discussions are not a big part of what the plan is in your syllabus, I do think it's worthwhile early in the term to even invest 20 minutes where you can say, turn to the person next to you, talk about
Mhm.
something that is, like that allows people to show up and be present as their full self. So one of the activities we use really early on as like an icebreaker is to ask people the story of their name. How did you come to be named what you're named? That is a really great way
Yeah.
to share some information about yourself, but also you can't help but share a little bit about your cultural background.
Absolutely,
But
absolutely.
you
Yeah.
could even be sharing what your favorite food is at Christmas or at whatever holiday you happen to celebrate, or, sharing, just taking a moment for that sharing person to person. It allows you, like, it primes the pump for further sharing,
And
right?
but you do a lot of interactive and you know diverse kind of classroom strategies in terms of getting people to share, to connect with one
And
another.
and I think that like my whole team came from a background of experiential learning. And when you're when the education that you're doing is in community, when you are working with young people to do like sort of debrief and reflect on their learning on a weekly basis, you can see how valuable that is as a kind of non-formal education. And so that's my background. So when I'm coming into an academic setting, I'm not going to academic tools, I'm going to more non-formal tools because that was my wheelhouse. And I think that it complements working with faculty effectively. And that's maybe why the nomination came, is because faculty have learned one particular way of being in a space that means teaching, and I've learned a different way, which yeah, I do think that it complements each other quite well.
It's funny, just a little observation also from this class that I do that is, it's a career integrated learning class. So we use
Mhm.
the Laurier competency framework, and we get the students to self-assess at the beginning of the term. And then we have a whole series of guest speakers, and we ask them, which of the 12 competencies that is in our framework do you feel is most important? And without fail, intercultural understanding,
Yeah,
right, is one of their top three or four without fail.
yeah, and you'll see that in like career focused literature right now too. Like, what is it that the employer is looking for?
Yeah.
That is something that helps somebody stand out in the crowd if they can talk about how they navigate working across difference, how they work effectively cross and interculturally. If they have the capacity to like identify that for themselves, it
Yeah.
really is something that would stand out to future
Well,
employers.
and especially if they're doing the intercultural certificate
Mhm.
or they're doing a course that has those, elements in it.
Yeah. I've been doing a lot of LinkedIn recommendations for students. It's something that I added as a way for them to acknowledge the learning that they've had. So they just have to ask me if they've completed the certificate. I'm happy to go onto their LinkedIn and just put a little blurb about what
Yeah.
what this certificate is and the fact that they've completed it, and then they can use that moving forward with future opportunities.
Yeah, and it's evidence that
Hmm. That they
they
invested,
demonstrate they've actually done
yeah,
this.
they've
That's
invested
great.
some time. Yeah.
In your training, though, your discussions, your classroom activities, you deal with a lot of challenging topics related to culture, like from colonialism to discrimination to white supremacy, right? And how do you help students navigate those topics? And I know you were, I think the way in which you start the class is really important. But what other ways are you using to get students to come to the intercultural table and discuss things that are make people very uncomfortable, especially right now, right?
I agree that all of these things make people uncomfortable, but my class experience with them is not the only place that they're navigating these things.
Right.
And so being open to conversations that use words that are challenging. When we use the words white supremacy, what do we mean by that? In our intercultural certificate, we're using a, a particular article that's been shared by Tema Oken, coming from work
Yeah.
with Kenneth Jones.
Yeah.
And so we're starting by creating a common vocabulary. And then once they're able to see that, look at little pieces of that article, and then is this showing up in our spaces? Are the antidotes that are being offered effective? I think, you know, students appreciate being able to speak and name and use common language for things that impact them every day. So, all of our students are impacted by colonialism,
Yep.
whether they come from Indigenous backgrounds or whether they're newcomers or whether their families have been settlers. It is a reality that Canada is in a truth and reconciliation mindset right now. And so we're all benefiting or facing barriers when we think about discrimination, when we think about all of these different things. Every one of us is navigating them. And so I just really believe that when students have the opportunity to discuss these things, if we've put in a framework where we're asking people
Yeah,
to
like how do you create that
critique,
safe space where they
it's
feel like they can,
the world isn't a
recognize
safe
they've got
space, right? So I
but your classroom is a safer space.
I
Let's
think
put it that
we're
way.
asking people to critique ideas and not each other.
Yes. Yes.
And so we're also
Yeah.
asking people to show up and recognize that we're all learning together.
Yeah.
That might mean unlearning, that might mean making mistakes. And so there's a lot of empathy that we're asking for. And I love one of the co-facilitators in the intercultural certificate is Dawn McDermott. And
Yeah. Yeah.
she always says, if you can't show up with empathy, at least show up with curiosity. And I think that is the same thing that I'm always sharing with students. And so, yeah, we're continually building empathy as we move through the course together, as we move
Yeah.
through any workshop together. Um, but again, I think like just because something is hard doesn't mean that it's not already present in the space. So if I avoid, saying difficult things, then I'm doing a disservice to everybody who's within that space. And so, yeah, I do think that students will use words like white supremacy and genocide and whatever else they want to say. It's going to come out of their mouths. And when it does, it shouldn't be like a bomb exploded. It should be an opportunity
So how do you
for
create
learning.
that culture of respect where people then can come to the intercultural table and address those tough issues and but in a manner that is let's, as you said, let's talk about the concept or the issue, not each
Yeah.
other, right? Don't
I,
personalize it.
Well, you can't say don't personalize it because every person is in the room as themselves with
Yep.
their entire identity. So yeah, I don't try to come in and set a boundary of rules or to say that we're creating a safe space because I think that's false because
Yeah.
we can't know what will impact a person. But I can say that when those impacts happen,
Yeah.
we will be intentional about how we navigate them. And so we'll have conversations about how to give feedback, or we'll have conversations about what it looks like to be respectful. And if respectful looks different for more than one person in the room, as it
Yeah.
will, then how do we show up acknowledging those differences? And I
Do you
think
do that at the beginning of the
yeah,
class?
I
Yeah.
think it depends how long we're spending time together,
Right, right.
because we do share norms. CSETI has developed some great norms for workshops that they do, and we borrow those from them. And I think asking students to share if things need to adapt or things need to change, then giving them that opportunity for feedback is really helpful as well.
That's another good tip for colleagues at Laurier,
Yeah, and I
right?
think I think part of it is just how you show up when you make a mistake too, because we will, as educators,
Yeah.
stumble or make a mistake or say something that's not exactly what we intended. And so if a person comes to you with that mistake, if you can see that as not um, if you can see that as a gift, because really it takes courage for somebody to tell you that you've done something wrong, and so they have already done an assessment within themselves that says I need to speak up about this. There's an impact that they need to share. So when you see that impact, if you can center whatever harm was that happened and focus on navigating that together, you're going to be stronger for it. But it takes kind of humility in that moment to be able to do that, right? And we are all not always our best selves. And so I think that's
That's
something
true.
where, yeah, that's super helpful.
So when the pandemic came, I'm just going to sort of
Yeah.
go back to what you said before. You made the shift and you did everything online and you did it really quickly, and you created resources that students and faculty could access virtually. Can you talk a little bit about that development process? Because all the things that you and I are talking about, this is interpersonal,
Yeah.
setting norms and coming to one another and defining what we mean and really, as you've said a few times, bringing your whole self. How do you do that online?
I think
And yet you did successfully.
it is complicated online, and I think even now, so we've shifted mostly back to in-person learning. So for example, the Laurier Intercultural Cultural Conversations,
Yes.
what we did with Professor Jacqueline, that is all in person now. So those groups are happening face to face. But our intercultural certificate, we're doing still many of those sessions via Zoom just because we found that students are more available, and we can do it by campus. So we can have Brantford and Laurier students in the
Yeah.
same workshop.
Yep. Yeah.
And I definitely think that people show up differently in a Zoom breakout group than they would if they were sitting around a table together. But we still can trust the possibility of conversations happening. We give guidelines to them. So when you're in a breakout group, we hope people will turn on their cameras if they're not able to because of whatever is happening, just to communicate in the chat with each other. But yeah, no, I do. I definitely think that when there's a different richness in being present in each other's lives personally, but if it can't happen, with some guidelines, I think that most people can do the same kinds of things together. And for some folks, they participate even more effectively in those Zoom spaces because I can ask for everybody to contribute something in the chat and we can read a cascade waterfall of all of their opinions about something. Where if I was in the classroom, that would take a really long time
I
for
was gonna say
everybody
it wouldn't happen.
to raise
Yeah,
their
all
hand
of
and
those
all
things. Yes.
share. And
Yes.
maybe there's people who wouldn't feel comfortable sharing.
Right.
So I do
Right.
think it's just recognizing the limits, but also those advantages to the technology as well, and trying to just keep a little bit of a pulse on what's fun for students in terms of technology. My colleague Jane Desmond often will bring like a little TikTok clip in to use as one of the ways of sharing. And so, yes, s- trying to use the technology as it exists. And I do think the initial shift was hard because we didn't have everything
Yes, it was.
uploaded and those kinds of things.
Yeah. Yeah.
But now that it's there and we're building on it, I definitely think that it's valuable to have it in both spaces. And yeah, for students who maybe want to do something asynchronously, then it is helpful to have those kind of guided questions and those kinds of activities. Even they can do them online just as well. Not I don't want to say just as well, but I think that there's pluses and minuses to both, and different kinds of learners are going to appreciate different ways of
Yeah.
getting.
I mean, it's changed forever
Mhm.
the way that we teach and the modes that we use, and it's very interesting to watch around the university how, you know, people are keeping some of the things that they did, during the pandemic, and then just pulling them into hybrid or remote or in-person
Even
classes
meeting
as
with
well.
students, there's a lot of students who wouldn't necessarily take the time to come to my office for an appointment,
Yeah,
but because they can use a booking form and set up an MS
they'll
Teams
reach out.
call, they will reach out,
Yeah,
we'll have a
yeah,
chat, they'll be able to move ahead much more quickly.
yeah.
And I think it actually saves time. So like I think it's valuable to kind of work virtually and in person as best you can.
One of the things that I wanted to talk about is that, so we're meeting today in Laurier's Circle Room, which is an Indigenous community space here on Brantford campus. And in your approaches to teaching, one of the things that you talk about is your own experiences with doing territorial acknowledgements. And as a learning opportunity for students, can you talk about that a little bit? Because
Yeah.
we're all kind of moving through this process of thinking about how we do territorial acknowledgements, right, with
Yeah.
our students.
My own understanding of the protocol that goes into land acknowledgement and territorial acknowledgements is that when indigenous nations are welcoming each other onto the land, that is created there. I don't think that's exactly how we practice it in the context of the work that we're doing, but I still think it's valuable to start each workshop or each meeting or each opportunity for gathering that we have together with a sincere acknowledgement of the territory, and not just a rote reading of a
Yeah,
script that
yeah,
says where
yeah,
Laurier's campuses are.
yeah,
I think it's important for us to connect our own journey on that land, how we're using the spaces that we take up, and what that looks like more moving forward in our connection with Indigenous community and the sustainability of the spaces that we're in. in for time moving forward. So how can we move forward in a good way? I also ask students, for example, if they're about to travel, to think about what knowledge they hold about where they live, where can they find resources when people have questions about the land where they come from, how can they know about the land that they're traveling to? Are there Indigenous folks in that community that they're traveling
So I
to?
was going to ask you
How
about
can they
some of the
connect?
things that you're doing with,
So,
teaching students to think about,
mhm.
before they head off.
And there's lots of great resources for them to
Yeah.
access how to like know the land. I really think it's important not to stop there. So we're not doing a territorial acknowledgement as something at the front end of our learning to
Yeah.
check a box and say, okay, we've done that. But we're opening the door to considering indigenous ways of doing and knowing, and all ways of doing and knowing, whether they're coming from different cultural contexts
Yeah.
within the context of our time together. So it's not just the front end of something that we're doing together, but it's, yeah, it's opening a door for continued conversation. And I'm not indigenous myself. I'm not a knowledge keeper myself, but I want to make space for other voices within the context of the work that we're doing together,
Hmm.
and to hold folks accountable to making space. And so I do think that that does set a tone that allows for many different kinds of identities to be present and to show up.
And what changes do you see in students sort of over time as you do this every workshop? Is this something that they feel increasingly like invested in?
Yeah, we do it differently each time, and different facilitators have their own way of using
Yeah.
a territorial acknowledgement at the beginning of the work that they're doing. We provide them resources. So in like my learning space, they have links that they can follow if they're trying to navigate that idea of doing a territorial acknowledgement themselves.
But also just their own
Hmm.
interaction or their own relationship to truth and reconciliation, and
Hmm.
where are they in this
Yeah,
national conversation and commitment and
I like this
action.
phrase reconciliation. I don't know who coined it.
Reconciliation, that's
I don't
great.
know
Yeah.
who coined it,
Yeah.
but I've seen it getting more use, and I think it really is moving beyond just this idea of learning for yourself and starting to think about what does that mean for you.
Yeah.
So we you said that we were in this beautiful space. Well, I could acknowledge that this space doesn't really belong to me, and so how this space is used, it's really not me that's the decision maker on that. Like there are folks um, who this space was designed to give voice, and so their voices are
Yeah.
how this space would be used. We work with what we have, and we keep learning, and we just have to acknowledge that it's not a closed conversation, it's evolving.
You know, one of the things that I think, and I've heard Laurier students say, is that the most impactful experience that they've had in their undergraduate education has been going abroad, and that they were never the same after. What kind of changes do you see in the students that go back? Do you get to interact with the students that come
Yeah,
back,
we
right?
once students return to campus, we do kind of a reentry debrief with them.
Reentry.
Yeah, we call it reentry, and it's an
Yeah.
opportunity for us to, share resources with them for next steps. Like we connect them with the career center. How can they internationalize their resume? Look at wellness related things if anything has happened. So those things are essential. But also just giving them a chance to share their story with somebody who wants to hear what they want to talk about. I
They've got
think
all this learning
I
and
think a
yeah,
lot of the time, our friends and family haven't seen us,
they
and
don't get it.
they might want to tell us the things that we've missed while we're gone and hear about certain landmarks that we've seen or certain experiences that they had, but they might not necessarily want to hear how, being responsible for yourself for the first time without your network of friends and family to support you created a whole new level of autonomy for you, or that you became passionate about a new language and now you want to seek new opportunities to speak it in other areas of the world, or there's so many different outcomes for students that are unexpected even to them. And yeah, I think it's helpful for them to reach back out to us because we've created a space where they can share those stories. They can also volunteer with us. So we have global engagement student ambassadors, a
Oh,
group of volunteers at
wonderful.
Laurier International where they can connect with other folks. They can promote the program to future students who might want to go on exchange, but they can also meet up with other like minded people who have had similar experiences. And that's really helpful, I think.
That's great. One of the things that you're a champion of is lifelong learning,
Mm.
right? So, continued personal development and growth and, how do you instill that lifelong learning mentality in your students, right? Who might be 19 or 20, right? Let's go out and let's keep learning.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think as I get older and the age gap between myself and the students that I'm working with is increasing, I start to have that reflection of like, my gosh, I'm going to be 50 soon. Do my students, um, is that who they're expecting to connect with when they reach out for support around their journeys that they're
Yeah,
having,
yeah.
age 18, 19, and 20. Um, but I don't see learning as only an academic pursuit.
No,
I see it
absolutely
as
not.
something
Yeah.
that exists like even right now as we're having a
Yeah,
conversation, we're
yeah.
learning from each other. And so yeah, I try to think about those non-formal ways that we share each other's lives and continue to be curious about each other. And I definitely think that travel and international experiences for some students can be a great way to continue that journey, but not everybody can afford that, or not everybody has the capacity to sort of set aside what they're doing in their day to day to step out in an international way. So I do think that kind of co-curricular opportunities for students create that opportunity to engage differently. So we also have something we call the tandem language program, where students who speak a particular language
Yeah.
can meet up with other students who want to practice that language and have
That's
conversations.
great.
So when our exchange students from abroad are here, maybe we have 4 or 5 people from Sweden who want to speak Swedish with each other, and then a student wants to learn it. We can help them connect, and that's a kind of lifelong learning journey where
Yeah.
language, as long as you're continuing to travel and move in the world, whether you go internationally or just down the street, you're going to hear languages that are different. And if you
But there
have
you're
that,
building
yeah,
connections
if you
again,
have that
too.
opportunity to even just learn a
Yeah.
few phrases, the connections are much more possible.
So then, what's on the horizon for your programming?
One of the things that's been really intriguing over the last year is that maybe the last year and a little bit is that some of our intercultural learning, we've gone out into the community to work with community partners.
Yes,
And
yes.
so that's something that has expanded over the last while. And it's been really interesting to see how things that we're doing with students who are 19, 20, 21 translate into folks in a work environment. And the difference is that a lot of the times when our students are coming to learn with us, they've chosen that learning. Whereas when we go to a
Right.
broader organization and everybody's been
Been
mandated to do,
told that they
yeah,
they
so
need to
it's an
do it.
interesting difference in the learner dynamic. But it's interesting to see how these things translate into just any space or any environment. That if we're working across difference, we need tools to do that. And so I'm really enjoying that. The other thing that's really been interesting for me is that I've been participating in the restorative justice community of practice. That's Sarah Scanlon and Humara
Yep.
Javed and Don McDermott and that team have instituted. And I think that it's so connected to the work that I've been doing, being able to work in circle, being able to um, center harm and look at outcomes related to how people can navigate mitigating that. I think it connects so much with intercultural learning. And so I don't know if it's specifically on my desk in like my job, but in my own lifelong learning, it's a direction that I'm exploring right now in terms of how we can show up in spaces to be more restorative, not just when problems happen, like not just as crisis response or as like response to behavior that we don't want to see, but just how can our own individual connections and community connections be restorative in nature? I think that's really um, the direction that I'm heading right now.
Thank you so much. This conversation has been packed with so many reflections. I'm going to be thinking about this for days.
Thank you. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
it, Deborah.
My thanks to Anne Marie Joy Henry for joining me today, and I hope you will join me for more conversations that celebrate exceptional teaching practices, explore diverse teaching philosophies, and discuss the future of higher education, teaching, and learning.